Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I, on behalf of the Australian Labor Party and the opposition, just congratulate the member for Higgins, who has just given her last speech, and we wish her all the very best for her and her family, and acknowledge her contribution and the sacrifice that families make when people choose to enter this House. So my very best wishes and that of everyone in this chamber. Can I now begin by speaking on the Future Drought Fund Bill 2018. Let me begin by saying that Labor certainly supports government action to help farmers make their operations more resilient in the face of drought. Drought has been a reality of life in this nation for a very long time. Given the harsh nature of our environment in this part of the world, it is a tribute to the tenacity and indeed the skill of our farmers that they have been so successful. They are tough, hard-working and efficient. Their task is being made even more difficult by climate change, which the experts agree is leading to an increase in the frequency and severity of extreme weather events. We see the evidence of this on our TV screens with dispiriting regularity. We see honest people struggling hard against the elements and facing crisis on an increasingly regular basis. It's not all about climate change, but climate change is a factor. Indeed, after years of denial, even some of those opposite accept the existence of climate change having been dragged to reality by groups like the National Farmers Federation in my home state of New South Wales. It certainly does make sense for the Australian government to work with our agricultural sector on drought resilience. We must assist our producers who do so much for our nation. However, we must also think carefully about how we fund this important work. The bill before us is inadequate. It asks us to create a future drought fund for that purpose. The interest from the fund would be used to deliver up to $100 million a year in project grants from 2020-2021. But it wouldn't be established by the government making an appropriation from government funds in the normal way, which it would for a purpose that it viewed to be valuable on its merits. It would be created by abolishing the existing Building Australia Fund. Now, this was created by the former Labor government in legislation that I introduced to this chamber as one of our first pieces of legislation after our election in December of 2007, or after we were sworn in on the 2nd of December 2007. The Building Australia Fund is a vital part of the Infrastructure Australia framework, because it can only be used for purposes of projects that have been approved by Infrastructure Australia and put on the priority list. Now, this government regards integrity and transparency when it comes to funding infrastructure with horror. This is the third attempt to abolish the Building Australia Fund. First, we were told that this was a necessary component of the asset recycling scheme, which the government set up to provide state governments with incentives to privatise public assets. It failed in the Senate. The second occasion was with the National Disability Insurance Scheme, something not linked to infrastructure at all. But we were told that we needed to transfer the money from the Building Australia Fund across to the NDIS if we were going to fund disability services. Now we're being told that in order to fund drought resilience measures by farmers, we need to abolish the Building Australia Fund. It's absurd. There's no link between the two things. We have committed the same amount of money for a drought fund as the government in the same time frame. The difference is our money will be real. It doesn't have to be taken from somewhere else with no relationship whatsoever. And I was trying to figure out what the relationship between the two issues is, Building Australia Fund and Future Drought Fund. The link is that they're both run by Nats in terms of the portfolio, the National Party. So quite clearly what's happened in the internal processes is that Minister Littleproud hasn't been able to secure support for the Future Drought Fund, so in terms of additional funding. So within the National Party, they've just had to transfer some money across from one fund to another, from Mr McCormick's responsibilities as the Infrastructure Minister to Minister Littleproud's responsibility as Agriculture Minister. I mean, that's absurd. What next? Take agriculture funding to fund a new airport? This is not the way to do good public policy. And we could have a consensus in this parliament across both sides about the outcomes and the process if the government just had a bit of common sense and said, well, we'll create a future drought fund, we'll bring in legislation, it will be for that purpose, it will consist of $100 million every year from 2020-21, and we'd all agree. It'd take 10 minutes, could be in place, could even talk about the time frame, maybe bring it forward. But instead, we have this obsession with getting rid of the Building Australia Fund simply because the National Party can't use it as a slush fund for whatever projects they want in regional or marginal, should I say, marginal regional electorates. I mean, this government is characterised, as we saw in today's question time and in the suspension of standing orders resolution, by a misuse of taxpayers' funds. And now what they want is to create a future drought fund that has no guidelines around it. Once again, instead of having some rigour about the use of taxpayers' funds, we have the National Party back to its old games. Remember the area consultative committees and the old funds, the regional Rorts program?
Yeah, that's terrible.
In this basis, there's no reason to think that the National Party wouldn't be about providing selective assistance to friends and mates rather than on the basis of the interests of farmers and the interests of making a difference and in the interests of need. And that's the problem with this. I mean, based upon expert advice, we'll look to fund the adoption of new efficient technology, on-farm infrastructure projects such as better water storage, better natural resource management for farms, projects to improve soil management and to build resilience to drought, floods and the changing climate. Within 60 days of taking office, we would create a panel of guardians to establish guidelines for the program. We'd include the farmer organisations in that process. The panel would include experts in water, soil and environmental science, an economist as well as representatives of the farming sector, local government and the Council of Australian Government. It will report to the Minister for Agriculture and will be asked to provide a detailed plan concerning the fund within 12 months if we're successful. Now, given that the fund doesn't come into operation until 2020-21, that is a practical, sensible suggestion. Establish a rigorous process so that the money wouldn't be invested on political whims, but on the genuine resilience projects that will make a real difference. Now, the government's proposal doesn't see any money flow until the financial year 2020-21. Our project would deliver projects as soon as the panel that I just mentioned finalised the arrangements within 12 months of a government. So let's be very clear. Labor guarantees the same level of funding as the government, delivered sooner, to fund projects chosen on the basis of genuine expert advice. A much better approach than eliminating the Building Australia Fund, an obsession for those opposite. And as part of their attack on Infrastructure Australia, for most of the term since the change of office in 2013, for most of the last 5.5 years, Infrastructure Australia hasn't had a CEO. They've had acting CEOs for most of that time. They've had circumstances whereby they abolished the major cities unit that was part of Infrastructure Australia. The Building Australia Fund was used for great projects like the Regional Rail Link, the biggest single federal investment in public transport infrastructure on record in our history, but also delivered many projects of direct benefit to the agricultural sector. Take the Ipswich motorway.
Exactly.
In the honourable member, the Shadow Minister for Immigration's area, out to Ipswich, making an enormous difference.
Huge, 100,000 vehicles a day.
To the sector to the west of Brisbane,
Lockyer Valley.
making an incredible difference in the Lockyer Valley and other areas. The Hunter Expressway, up to that pristine prime land that is up in the plains of New England, providing that linkage that's there. The reason why those projects had high benefit cost ratios was because of the freight that goes on those roads, much of it agricultural produce. So these projects delivered real change by boosting productivity and helping farmers get their products to market, both domestic and internationally, more quickly. Now, the government talks about its commitment to agricultural producers, but the fact is its record when it comes to infrastructure investment, which will benefit the regions, is very poor indeed. When you look at just the underspends that are there, now the promised spending in budgets on the Beef Roads program, if you look at it, was $145 million over recent years. The actual final budget outcome shows that just $56 million was expended. 61% of funding not used, underspent. The Heavy Vehicle Safety Program, $292 million promised, actual $157 million delivered, a 46% underspent. The Northern Australian Roads Program, $520 million committed in budgets by the government itself on budget night. $280 million actually invested, a 44% reduction. The Bridges Renewal Program, so important to lift productivity in agricultural sectors to allow for goods to get to market. Again, only $220 million of that $375 million that was committed in budgets was actually spent, a 41% reduction. Now, contrast that with what we did in government, creating the Regional Development Australia program, creating the Regional and Local Community Infrastructure program, committing to major road and rail infrastructure, including on the Bruce and the Pacific highways, rebuilding 1/3 of the interstate rail freight network, making an enormous difference, making the first serious investments in the Inland Rail project. So we think that the government has got the detail of this wrong. We need proper guidelines and rigour, but we also need proper funding for it, because our farmers deserve that proper funding on its merits, not taking it from somewhere else, not taking it from Peter to pay Paul, making sure that we actually deliver more investment.
Thank you, Member for Green.